to Lynn and to introduce Lynn Jones for those that don't know him already. Lynn, first and foremost, Lynn is a WFS member. He's also Emeritus Professor of Plant Ecology at Dundee University. He's an author. He's written Plants and Microclimate, a quantitative approach to environmental physiology. That's a mouthful. It sounds very erudite, plus numerous academic papers. He's a developer of the plant identification app Visual Flora. But last but by no means least, what's one of the most impressive things about Lynn, he can get down Benlawes in about 30 minutes. Well done, Lynn Jones. Okay, Lynn, over to you.
Okay, well, we will try and share the screen and see what happens. Do you all have a screen, hopefully? Good. So it's great to get a chance to talk about some botany, even if we can't really get together to do it. I'm hoping that we can sometime in the future. This talk is largely based on a visit to St. Moritz in 2017, June 2017. So this is a photograph of the Engadine Valley with St. Moritz here. Going up the valley to the pass over to Italy, that's the Maloja Pass. And if we go to the left of this picture, it takes you up to the Bernina Pass, again over into Italy. And I'll be talking about flowers on the various mountains and valleys in this sort of area. Of course, I'm sure most of you have heard of St. Moritz, probably as a ski resort. Its origins as a ski resort actually date back to about 1864, though it was a resort for a summer resort before that. The owner of the Kulm in those days bet a number of the summer British tourists that they would have a fantastic time if they came in winter and they could sit out on the balcony in their shirt sleeves and enjoy themselves. And he said that if you don't, I'll refund your travel costs and your living expenses. But they came and they enjoyed it. It's been famous for winter sports for many years now. They've had 2 Olympics here and many Alpine World Championships. They've got all these exciting things like Bob Run, the Cresta Run, though I'm not sure that I want to do either of these, and particularly the Cresta, where you go down a vertical ice wall on a tea tray with your nose a couple of inches from the ice. That's not me at all. I'm not sure that even this is me. In summer, they have this in February, I should say, they have this white turf festival where they build a village on the ice on the lake and have horse racing. They play cricket on the ice sometimes. This was actually February last year, almost exactly a year ago. I wonder, seems more like 5 years ago to me. Of course, St. Moritz is famous for expenditure. You can spend an awful lot of money buying things in Gucci, whoops, let's go back one, in Gucci, Bulgari, Versace, or whatever. You can even buy haute couture for your dog, special feet, even pearl necklace. Of course, We never go to these shops. All we go to when we're there is the co-op. And even then, one time, Amanda made a serious mistake. She bought steak for the whole family in the co-op. And I had to look very seriously at my bank account for some weeks or months after that. So, where is it? St. Moritz is right in the southeast corner of Switzerland, in the Engadine. This is the Engadine Valley, which goes down here, joins the Inn in Austria, goes through Innsbruck, and eventually joins the Danube. But it arises up in this area around St. Moritz in the upper Engadine. This is in the canton of Graubünden, otherwise known as Grisons, which is actually the largest Swiss canton. They speak primarily German or Romanche, but of course they also speak a lot of Italian, being so close to Italy. So let's move on to the plants. Many of the plants we see when we're wandering around in the summer are things we're very familiar with, and you can see lots of them in this picture. Hogweed and cow parsley, buttercups, and sheets of bistort. However, the reason we go somewhere like this is to see the more interesting plants. For example, it's particularly exciting to see some of our great rarities, often growing in relative profusion. And perhaps the first one to talk about is the Snowden Lily. Here we have a cliff on Snowden with a colleague of mine, Derry Thomas, and his wife, searching hard for Snowden lilies, which, as you probably know, only grow in the Snowden range in Britain. If you're very lucky, you will actually find one in flower. It's hard work, but you can sometimes do it. Go to St. Moritz, however, and you can see oodles of them, often with a much more interesting background flora. Here we have a gentian, and they are relatively common in Switzerland. Here we have a distribution map of southeastern corner of Switzerland with the green dots, or all the dots and circles showing where they're known. Other plants that are extreme rarities for us include things like the Alpine Milk Veg. And I know quite a number of you have actually been to Benvraki, which is this mountain here, and explored this area of limestone cliffs and found Alpine Milk Veg there. Of course, in Switzerland, it occurs over a much larger area. And here is an example from St. Moritz. Other things that people who've been with me on walks, including that to Benvraki, may remember is World Solomon seal, Polygonum verticillatum. This, as you can see from the BSBI map, really only occurs in a few wooded, deep valleys in Perthshire and Angus. In Switzerland, however, it's much more common. And here we are walking in the woods above the village, where I'm actually taking some photos of it, but there's some very good examples just right behind me. Yet another example is purple coltsfoot. Again, many members of the Wildflower Society have been up to Glencova looking to see purple coltsfoot, and it grows on a cliff on this crag here somewhere. Now, there's a lot of doubt as to whether it's native here, but It was actually found in about 1795 by George Donne. Now, George Donne is a very famous botanist, and he established a nursery at Dew Hillock in Forfar, where he grew a wide range of plants. And so it has been suggested that he planted it here. I think there's possibly not true. It may well be a native example, because he didn't start his nursery until several years after he reported the find of purple coltsfoot at this site. He is very famous for finding almost all the rarities that grow in these hills, many of which are now accepted as native, and it has survived. Anyway, who's to know? Here we are growing in Switzerland above the village in the woodland, and it's widespread there. Another rarity that we have, and Wildflower Society people will trek across the country to see it at either Teesdale or Ben Lawes. This is Alpine Forget-Me-Not. Again, it's quite common in Switzerland and especially above St. Moritz. Even our somewhat less rare species, but still uncommon, are exciting to find. And I can just show you a few examples at this stage. Purple Saxifrage is one which is a widespread plant around the world, but as you'd expect, it grows in the Alps around St. Moritz. Mountain azalea. Here we have an example on Glass Mole in Perthshire, but it grows in rather nicer environments, I reckon, in Valmirai above St. Moritz again. Even these rather dull things like net-leaved willow become much more common in appropriate environments in the Alps. A lovely plant, dwarf campion, Silene corlis. Those who've been up into the Scottish mountains will have seen this quite frequently, but it's even more frequent and comes with a much better, I reckon, associated flora in above St. Moritz. Many of you will have seen mountain arvens, Dryas octopetala, in its relatively few places it grows in Britain. It's a mountain plant, mostly on limestone, except in the extreme north of Scotland, as here at Durness, or on the Burren, where it comes nearly down to sea level. But move to St. Moritz, and there's vast sheets of it in appropriate areas. This one just immediately above the village. Some of us will go out of our way to find a globe flower, Troleus, in Britain. Here's an example from Ben Lawes, but it can grow in sheets at Lage de Stars, close to the village in St. Moritz, or even further up, higher altitudes at the Bernina Pass. So there are lots of these plants which are relatively uncommon for us, but common as mud up in the Alps. Even better, perhaps, are those plants which are different completely, either slightly different or more so. But here we have some which have similar species in the Alps and at home. Many of you will know of Mountain Everlasting. Now that occurs both in Britain and in the Alps, but there are other species related which we can find in the Alps. And this one's Antonaria carpatica, again, just above the village. Other ones, another area is yellow rattles. On the left, we've got a photo of the two native yellow rattle species for Britain. The common yellow rattle, here on the left, Rhinanthus minor, which grows everywhere and is an essential food, seed for any wildflower mix. And the much rarer, greater yellow rattle, in fact here photographed at a reintroduction site in Dundee. And I rather like this picture, the two parents clucking over their children. But in the Alps, there are about 4 or 5 species. And in fact, the commonest in the Alps above the village was this particular species. Or we can find totally different plants. One of my favorites is the spotted yellow gentian, Gentiana punctata. And this is frequent in the meadows at the edge of the woodland, above the village and in the valley floors. It's a gorgeous flower. Or another one, not quite so common, that we saw in several places was this one, the globe daisy, Globularia Cordifolia. Now, I needed a key to find out what this was. There was no way I knew. In fact, I would never have guessed it was Plantagenaceae, though it has only recently become that. It was previously a family totally unheard of, the Globulariaceae. But as you can see, it's quite common across quite a bit of Switzerland. So, but this brings us to a problem when we're going to an area we don't know the plants. How do we know what they are? How do we identify them? So we've got a lot of tools available. Scattered around the village, you'll find posters of some of the commonest, more spectacular species. There are a number of flower books available. 2 particular ones that I've used are Mountain Flowers of Europe or this Alpine Flowers by Gray Wilson and Marjorie Blaney. Now, of course, these cover all alpine regions of Europe and have about 1,200 to 1,300 species. Of course, in Switzerland alone, there are about 3,600 species. So we might need something a bit more detailed. So what other options are there? As a sideline, I might mention the Engadine Museum in the centre of St. Moritz. This is a museum of alpine culture from the 15th to the 19th century and has recently been refurbished. It's a fantastic museum. If you go there, I highly recommend visiting. But as well as its rooms made out for different ages, 17th, 18th century or whatever, it has a display of pressed flowers, which are in fact rather good and also very useful. For example, here, whoops, if we go back one, here we have a pressed version of our yellow spotted gentian, Gentiana punctata, and it has some rather nice pressed specimens of a couple of Lasopitium species, carrot family plants, but a genus that we don't get in Britain and are quite common in the Alps, and we'll see quite a lot of them. Another thing one can do is you can make use of effectively the local botanic garden. Heidi's Blumenweg, they have planted along a nice, solid, level path, a whole series of beds with numbers and a key with all the different local alpine plants. So this can give us a good idea to interpret them. Now this Blumenweg is here. It's about 3/4 of an hour walk up from the village, or else one can take a funicular railway from which it's a nice level walk. Another approach is you can use automatic plant ID apps, and I suggest here my 5 favorite ones, including Seek, which is the only one which doesn't require internet connection. Now, if you want to know more about these, I point you to the talk I gave the Botanical Society of Scotland. You just need to look on their YouTube channel, and I've given a talk explaining the power of these different apps. So moving on, what we really need is the Swiss Stace, that is Flora Helvetica. Unfortunately, my budget doesn't really extend to £170 for a very heavy, unfield friendly book. There is an app also, but that's about €100 or 100 Swiss francs. However, luckily, it also comes as in a free version, which doesn't have any of the pictures or the details about the plants. But what it does have is it has a key, or a number of really very useful keys. Unfortunately, it's only in French or German. I'm showing you the French version. But it does, so it's got these multi-access keys, a simple multi-access key or a much more complicated one, which has over 350 different criteria in which it selects the species. Looking at the simple one, I've actually tried it out for a daisy. I've just ticked the correct boxes for a daisy. It's that sort of a flower. It's rather dwarf, white flowers. It's got a daisy-shaped flower, quite a lot of petals, and so on. Check what it finds, and it'll give you a list of species that fit that character. So it's quite nice, simple, easy to use. You don't need your language skills. Or you can use a more complicated version of that. Or you can use one of the Dichotomous Keys, and it's got a whole series. They're brilliant ones. And I'll just show you one, which is the family's key. I've selected the carrot family, Apiaceae, and by answering some questions, the first one is whether the umbels are complex or simple. I've suggested they're complex, and I've ticked that. Flowers yellow or other coloured, I've suggested they're yellow. And it asks then, are the leaves entire or divided? And I've ticked entire, and it's come up with these options, biplurum. Now, the other alternative is there's a very good Swiss website which has a list of all the Swiss flowers, and I look at them, and we can look at the distribution of each of those, and it gives it on a 5 kilometer grid. So each dot refers to a 5 kilometer grid. It's quite a flexible website. You can push this slider along the bottom, and it gives you plants which have been seen since that date. I won't do it at the moment, but you can easily go onto that website and play with it. This is looking at this Globularia species for the Engadine Valley. It's interesting, we can see that it's actually not being found recently in quite a lot of squares. So perhaps it's declining substantially, though there are 3 squares where it's been found, and not yet validated. Okay, so that's enough for the introduction. I think what I'll do now is I'll talk through some walks in a couple of areas around in the Engadine Valley, and starting with a walk through the woods and up into the Alps immediately above the village. So we're talking about an altitude range from about 1,800 meters to 2,000 to 2,100 meters. And just to use the Google Earth image, unfortunately, you may be slightly confused. It's upside down. We have south to the top of the map. So Italy is over to the top of the map. This is the village, St. Moritz. We're going up the Engadine Valley to Maloja, the Maloja Pass, over down into Italy and Lake Como, or go up through Pontresina and up over the Bernina Pass, again down into Italy. And we're talking about this area just above the village. So here we are, setting off, walking up from the village through the woodland immediately above the village, finding the polygonatum as we've seen before, finding lots of other lovely plants, including the purple coltsfoot, a lungwort, but the first of my favorites, which is the Alpine pasque-flower, Pulsilla alpina. This one's the subspecies Epiifolia, which to me was fantastic. It was all over the place, and it's just spectacular. Here we even have a hoverfly who also thought it was lovely. Climbing higher, we came across a very good stand of round-headed rampion. Now, for those of us who live in Scotland, this was a lovely sight. It doesn't grow in Scotland. It doesn't even grow in the north of England, as far as I know. It really only occurs on the chalk downland in the south. There are other species of rampion. There are at least two others which were quite common. This is one of the ones we saw, the Phytuma betanicifolium. Now, the one on the right is interesting because this is Good King Henry, which many of you will be familiar with. Now, BSBI map for Scotland says this should occur in lots of places in Scotland, yet I have never seen it yet here. It's definitely not as common as it used to be. But so it was very nice to see it here. Coming out of the top of the woods, we then get to these wonderful Alpine meadows with oxeye daisies, buttercups, scabious, and of course a lot of this yellow rattle that I showed you earlier. The owner of this house got rather annoyed with me for walking on his lawn. Of course, the other things that grow on this sort of site are things like the round-headed orchid, which is, again, this was something totally new to me. I hadn't come across before. Traustina globosa, a beautiful thing. It wasn't actually quite globose at this stage, but it became, presumably will do, become so later. And other orchids. Another one which was totally new to me was the vanilla orchid, which again was quite common, the one on the right here. Of course, I had to show you this rather nice photo of our old friend that we often find in Britain, the frog orchid. And there were lots of other things that I'm not particularly familiar with. For example, this small toadflax was actually quite a common weed in areas in the village. And it was fantastic to see lots and lots of yellow milk veg, Oxytropis campestris. Those of you who've been looking for it in Britain know that it only grows in 2 or 3 places. And it's quite hard to get to even there, if you remember climbing up the scree slope in Cordifolia. So that's the area around the village. The next area I want to explore is the Mortis Murae and the Val Murae. Take this wonderful Victorian funicular railway to the top, 2,456 meters, and then you can walk up. We walked up to about 2,700 meters by the snow and the glacier lake at the top, and walked back down to the village. Again, here's our map of the area, and we can see it's an hour and a half, an hour and 20-minute walk from the village, or you can take a bus or train up the funicular and explore. You get spectacular views. Here we are at the top of the funicular, again looking along the Engadine Valley with Pontresina just up to the left here. If we turn left from this panorama, we come to this, and this is the view where we were walking. Now in winter, this is a toboggan run. Starts off pretty delicate, but it becomes pretty hairy. And in fact, if we try this is just a short clip, which I thought you'd like to see, of going down this toboggan run, if it'll do it. Not my photography, but on the same sort of time that we went down. It starts off nice and gentle, but as you can see, it's got lots of protection down the sides. Much of that wasn't there when we first went down, and I lost, or very nearly lost, 1 or 2 grandchildren over one of these edges. But luckily, I think they did just survive. It's pretty hard work. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's probably enough on that. Let's go back to the plants. So here we are walking up the valley, spectacular alpine scenery as you'd expect, and as you'd expect, spectacular alpine vegetation. The lower areas, just above the funicular station, lots of this alpine passiflora, different sorts of buttercup, one's completely new to me, Ranunculus coitferi, and then several Geum montanum here, Veronica, Alpine Veronica species, wonderful vegetation. We could have stayed for hours, but we thought we'd carry on and get a bit higher. When we came to these spectacular shows of things like spring gentian, Gentiana verna. Now, of course, we do get this in Britain. There's a little bit on the Burren, there's a little bit at Teesdale, but not these fantastic shows. One of the most fantastic flowers I know. And then lots of other gentians, the dwarf gentian, which is, many people think, characteristic of the Alps. And even particularly nice to see lots of snow gentian. Here we have snow gentian in the Val Murai, and on the right, I thought I'd at least show that we do get it in Britain. This is a Ben Lawes version. As we got up to the lake at the top of the valley, the vegetation is clearly snow patch vegetation, just starting to come out. Looks pretty bleak from this sort of view, but clearly I've found something exciting and I'm taking photos. But there's lots hiding in the rocks. Not least, lots of purple saxifrage, and lots of other saxifrages, ones we don't get. And I particularly liked this species, Saxifraga seguirii, which is very unusual and, I really liked. Then, in the same area, we come across sheets of these. This case, we've got primulas. This one's Primula integrifolia, occurring in a solid mass. And here's a close-up, and similarly close-up of a very similar species, Primula latifolia, which also occurs in just the same place. But my absolute favorite is the dwarf snowbell, Soldernella Pulsilla. To me, this is the epitome of an alpine plant. He just looks so much at home. There he is, and he's beauteous when you look at him closely. And there are lots of other plants which are uncommon, but are mountain plants like Arabis alpina, and all this vegetation around is Salix herbacea, which you'll be familiar with from the top of British mountains, those of you who've been. Anyway, coming down, you leave the more high alpine areas, you come into the tree area, tree-lined glades, and the vegetation gets deeper. And lots of plants. And here we can see Amanda, who's just walked past this guy's home without noticing him. She was so busy looking at the plants. There he is, closer up, the Marmot. There were lots of marmots in this little patch as we went down. Unfortunately, we missed out. We didn't see any of the ibex. Then we're down in these Alpine meadows with lots of different flowers, many of which we're not familiar with, including this rather nice Daphne species. At the bottom, we had a rather challenging walk through a herd of Highland cattle with their rather frightening looking horns, but they let us through with no damage, luckily. Okay, let's move on to another site. This is the Mortar Glacier Valley. We walked from Mortar Station, which is about 1900 meters, towards the glacier front, which is nearer 2000 something meters. So this is a little bit up the Pontresina Valley towards the Bernina Pass in Italy. It's here. In fact, it is probably my favorite long off-piste ski run in winter. If you take the Diavolezza cable car up, which it shows here on the left, and you can ski all the way down this valley to the station. And here we have us about halfway down the glacier after a little bit of a climb, because it's not all downhill. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to do that for quite a few years now. The last couple of times we've been there, the run has been closed. Here it is in summer, from a bit lower down, obviously, looking up into the Bernina Massif. Now, this glacier is a good example of how glaciers are retreating. I mean, it's very much a tourist glacier, but unfortunately, it's now disappearing from easy access. It's retreating so fast. In fact, in 1860, this glacier extended all the way to the station. By 2020, it had retreated by about 3.4 kilometers. And in fact, 550 meters of that was since the year 2000. Which means that this area here would have been covered in glacier until about 20 years ago. And all this vegetation has established itself since then. So the question that some of you may be wondering is, what is glacier retreat going to do to the flora? Now, many of you may have seen either this article in The Guardian or similar articles in several of the other newspapers in January, with the headline, "Alpine plants face extinction as melting glaciers force them higher," warns a study. An escalator to extinction as aggressive species will eventually take over. In fact, are we just going to have buttercups and daisies at the tops of our mountains? Now, the original paper by Loziapo and colleagues studied 4 glaciers in this region just over the Alps in Italy. And I won't go into detail about the paper, but they did not really say that alpine plants face extinction, certainly not in the near or foreseeable future. This paper concentrates particularly on total glacier extinction, not really looking at the key step of recolonization of bare ground during retreat. Of course, it doesn't really take account of the fact that glacier snouts are not representative of typical snowpatch vegetation, as the snouts are often at much lower altitudes, i.e. warmer. So the vegetation there is not representative of the high alpine vegetation often. As long as the extreme environment of late snow patches exists, the physical constraints that cause should keep high alpine rarities surviving against both the competitive late succession species and the ruderal species, the ones that come in very quickly. I hope. That is just a matter of hope. I thought I'd just show you, while we're at it, a couple of other glacier pictures. Way back in 1919, a Swiss pilot took some wonderful photographs of the glaciers on the Mont Blanc Massif. This is the Mer de Glace, the longest glacier. And some colleagues of mine at Dundee University, Kieran Baxter and Alice Waterston, in 2019 took a helicopter, positioned it in exactly the same spot, and got the comparable thing. You can see this dramatic loss of the glacier. But even my pictures between 1978 and 2014 from Chamonix of this bottom end of the Mer de Glace, if we look in this valley at the bottom, we can see the snow level, or the ice level, has fallen by nearly 100 meters in that period. Looking up more closely, here we have a marker which indicates where the glacier was in 1990, where it was in 2003. down many, many, many flights of steps which they've had to build, and down many, many, many more flights of steps down to 2000, where it was in 2014. When I first skied down here, the glacier was way above the height of this picture. Here we have just an enlargement to show the many, many steps you now have to climb up to get off the glacier and back over to Chamonix. Anyway, what I thought I'd say a little bit about is in 2017, a group at Utrecht University were considering what we can do about glacier retreat. Typically at ski resorts, the ski resort collects the snow, piles it in heaps, and covers it with white plastic during the summer so it reflects the sunlight and stops it melting. This group in Utrecht were suggesting applying snow machines over a large area of the glacier in summer, taking the odd cold nights when there is enough, it's cold enough to make snow, using the meltwater from the glacier as a source of water and spraying it. And they've done a calculation that on the Mortar glacier, if they cover about 0.8 of a square kilometre of the glacier during the summer with new snow, making it nice and shiny white so it doesn't melt as quickly, they should be able to increase the length of the glacier by about 0.8 kilometre by the year 2100, assuming current climate change predictions. Whether they're right or not, who knows? And anyway, I imagine it would be rather expensive to do it on a large scale. Anyway, just some plants. As a relatively newly colonized area, there weren't many different species along this walk from the station to the glacier, but there were a number of new ones new to me. Things like this, Adenostyles, whoops. Adenostyles, this rather lovely milfoil, which is fairly widespread, and the archetypal alpine species, monkshood. In the same area, we've got the Bernina Pass, with a few species there, but I won't dwell on these. They're just a bit further up the valley. Botanists at work taking photos, and taking photos of botanists taking photos, and taking photos of people taking photos of botany, etc. But some lovely plants, including a range of pinguicular butterwort species and a local rarity, or a Swiss rarity, dragon's mouth. This only occurs in a very small number of squares in Switzerland. Anyway, I wanted to finish with a final walk back to the village from the Corvatsch mountain, taking the cable car up to the mid-station, walking to Funicular, and then down a fantastic black ski run to the village. So here we are in the village, take the cable car up there, and then long walk through the woods and so eventually back to the village. At the top, this is looking across to Funicular from the start. You'll see we've got a pretty bleak landscape. This is Glacial Moraine, which has hardly been recolonized. At the top, we have classic snowpatch vegetation and spectacular views, of course, with, whoops, gorgeous species. Yet another of my favorites, the glory of the snow. which is obviously a forget-me-not type of plant, but absolutely spectacular when you see it. And lots of Saxifrages, the classic snow patch vegetation, Ranunculus glacialis and GM reptans, Androsaci species, and of course the Snowball, and even one that we're familiar with, Mossy Sifal. So carrying on down the mountain, again, as the whole of our stay, it was another fantastic day, we can see on the mountain opposite an area where they've been piling up the snow for a skiing snow park. And again, they're all covered in white plastic to keep the snow for the next year. And what they do there is this. This is the snow park in winter. And this is one of our granddaughters showing off. It's one of our granddaughters showing off. But since it's not botany, we'll move rapidly on. Lots of scree slopes. And we're now getting down into the area with wonderful views right the way down. Whoops. Right the way down. And lots of plants. Different species to what we ever get in this country. 2 different campanula species and one of many pedicularis species. I think there are about 12 pedicularis species occurring in the Engadine Valley. Down towards the village, we have rhododendrons, lots of the Daphne striata that we saw earlier, and we're down at the bottom. And just to finish, I thought I'd show you something different. The butterflies. There were fantastic displays of butterflies from different blue species, Argus, fritillaries, eggers, egger moths, 2 other fritillaries, more butterflies, and so on. And I'd just like to thank, first of all, Kat and Rudy for letting us stay in their apartment. And then I'd like to thank my co-explorers, Amanda, my wife, Chris, my brother, and in memory of Anne, Chris's wife, who sadly died about a year after this. Thank you. And to the next time, if we can ever visit again, you're welcome to come too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you.